dear students and dear participants. My first series of thoughts is about precisely the theme that I have chosen. And the theme was this: how can fear be turned into hope? So there has been a rapid succession of crises since the collapse of the Lehman Brothers in the United States in 2008, the beginning of the financial crisis. For Europeans, this was followed by the crisis in the eurozone between 2010 and the end of 2012, accompanied by an economic recession. A second stage in this permanent crisis in Europe was the European refugee crisis of 2015 and 2016, climate disasters caused by water and by fire, terrorist attacks in numerous European cities in 2015 and 2016, among them in my own city here in Brussels, followed by the pandemic that lasted almost 3 years, the war in Ukraine since the 22nd of February 2022, and the resulting high inflation in this country, my country. Inflation went up to 12% in September 2022. And this inflation peak was followed by the trade war launched by the United States in April of this year. Of course, there are the structural problems. I mentioned already climate change, but I can also add the growing inequalities in our societies. So many are wondering, given the long series of crises, what will be the next crisis? All these developments created uncertainty and fear. This uncertainty and fear was translated politically in sometimes desperate longing for a new form of stability, a new form of control. The result of this is an increase in the rise of extremism, the fragmentation of the party political landscape, and the instability of national governments in the so-called, even in the so-called bigger member states. So we have a volatility in the elections and an instability in the governments. Emotions have become more important, but mostly negative emotions, such as anger, frustration, revenge, envy, hate. By the way, this is not a monopoly of the European Union. The same is happening even stronger in the Anglo-Saxon world, in the UK, and in the United States. Today, we are also seeing the effects of the excessive individualization of life, in the rise of civilization diseases linked to the way in which we live our lives. Mental health is being affected by high rates of depression and burnout, by all kinds of addictions to alcohol, drugs, and gaming, and by suicide or attempts to suicide. Young people suffer from this even more than the older generation. So it's not only this fear and instability related to macro political or macroeconomic developments such as the permanent crisis. It's also related to our way of life. So the big challenge is how to turn fear into hope. And we are all hoping for more hope. My second series of considerations is about a lack of trust. We live in a time when political decisions determine economic developments. So it's the time of what we can call the primacy of politics. It means the return of the primacy of politics, and evidence of this can be seen in Brexit, a highly political decision, not an economic decision, on the contrary. The tariff war launched by the American president, not a decision based on economic rationality at all. And of course, the war against Ukraine, which was a purely political decision. Today, economic policy is political economy. And this is not just playing with words, but it's a summary of what we are living through these days. Economic policy is political economy. The primacy of politics also means the return of nationalism and thus war, as President Mitterrand once said. Le nationalisme, c'est la guerre. That's what the exact quotation was. At the same time, when we speak about war, it is the return of tragedy in history. The primary reason for this loss of mutual trust is the war in Ukraine. The Europeans have broken with Russia, but China has not. And by the way, the normalization of our relationship with China depends in part on the outcome of the war, which for the Union is an existential war. By the way, the trade relations between the EU and China are also at an all-time low in all areas. A growing, already enormous trade deficit, for sure in goods, 300 billion euros, export restrictions on critical Chinese raw materials, and the threat of using the anti-coercion instrument by the European Commission. The second factor contributing to global mistrust is, of course, the erratic and unilateral foreign policy of the United States. In any case, the America First approach is not likely to disappear anytime soon, even under a possible democratic president. And we Europeans, we will have to learn to live with that. On the short term, the softening of the trade war, which is going on, can be a relief also economically, but uncertainty and mistrust will remain for a very long time. I was speaking about the splendid isolation. It's an English word going back to a few centuries. A splendid isolation is never splendid in the long term, not even on the short term. This combination of isolationism and unilateralism will always backfire. If a country, as the United States, on top of this, try to humiliate others, the reaction can be rapid and brutal. Look at India, hit by American sanctions. It sought a rapprochement with China. America is uniting its enemies and dividing its friends. Unilateralism is the opposite of multilateralism. And multilateralism is in the European interest. It's in the European interest to have peace and international rules on trade and climate, among other things. Trade and climate commonly referred to as the multilateral order. So we have a big interest in stable international institutions and developments. And we see the fading of classic multilateralism because countries are not playing by the rules, for instance, of the World Trade Organization, the WTO. I think at the tariff war and unfair competition. We see the fading of classic multilateralism because international law and laws of the war are ignored as well. I'm referring to Ukraine and, of course, also to what happened in Gaza. The same is happening with the rulings of the International Criminal Court are not respected, the Paris climate targets, and so on. We are already living in the law of the jungle. Multilateral institutions still exist, but function rather poorly. We must continue to defend them and, if necessary, to reform them. However, we cannot be the only ones who still believe in it. If there is one area where we need to work together internationally, it is climate change. It still is the biggest threat to mankind. The United States has once again withdrawn from the Paris agreements of 2015. China and the EU recently adopted a common statement on this issue. Today, Europe is responsible for only 6% of greenhouse gas emissions. I emphasize today, because in the past, of course, we are much bigger polluters. But here too, the time for good intentions is over. We need results much more than we have already achieved as a global community and as a European Union. Speaking of the European Union and speaking about results, since 1990, the EU has seen a 37% reduction in greenhouse gas emissions, despite a doubling of real GDP. So in Europe, in the European Union, there is therefore already now a decoupling of pollution and economic growth, which is a big achievement, but it's not enough. And for sure, globally, we are not respecting the Paris agreements. A third series of thoughts is, I started with the title, More Europe Instead of Less Europe. The feeling of powerlessness among many people in the face of violence and war has even reinforced the feeling that the European Union is needed more than ever, because nation states are no longer able to provide the necessary answers to the big challenges of our time. The Eurobarometer of the European Commission indicates that the confidence in the EU and the euro are now at its highest level in almost 20 years. There is much talk about Euroscepticism, but underneath there is a recognition of the Europe of necessity. I sometimes feel that leaders think and act less European than their voters. I admit that this is a provocative thought. So I emphasize again that the confidence in the EU and the euro are now at its highest level in almost 20 years. Amidst the emotionality, and I described it a few minutes ago, amidst the emotionality, many Europeans still know well where their interests and where their future ultimately lie. Today, no one wants to leave the European Union anymore. Exit the exit story, by the way, after the disaster of Brexit. The EU is still attractive. We have a queue of candidate countries. However, the title of this series was Mistrust. However, that trust in the EU must continue to be earned. The Union can only be strong and achieve results for its citizens if we are politically united. And that unity is often greater than many people think, especially in times of crisis. I give you a few examples. Our joint European response in the form of vaccines during the COVID time, in the COVID time. A huge economic recovery fund of 800 billion euros launched in 2020. 19 sanctions packages against Russia that require unanimity each semester. We succeeded in having that unity and unanimity since the start of the Ukrainian war. However, achieving that unity has now become more difficult. Not so much because of the behavior of a few small countries, we know their names, but because of disagreements between larger European countries. So in times of crisis, in times of permanent crisis, leadership is needed. The problem is that a number of larger European countries are struggling with internal political problems, even with minority governments. And this is, for instance, the case in bigger Western European countries. The question is, can Europe be strong if those member states are weak? To some extent, Europe is the sum of the member states. And if the member states are weak, how can Europe as a whole be strong? It can. In times of crisis, we have transcended our internal and external problems in the past. But in the longer term, no real progress is possible without leadership, also in less turbulent times. We are often united in times of crisis, but we should be united also in less turbulent times. Had we been more united, we might have been able to respond better to President Trump in the tariff war. This whole painful story confirms that we need more strategic independence. We spoke about strategic autonomy. We speak these days about strategic independence. We are too dependent on other global actors, such as China and the US, certainly in a number of sectors. We have cut off almost all ties with Russia for good, primarily in the field of energy. By 2028, we will hardly import any Russian gas anymore. But our excessive dependence on other countries is clear, also in terms of batteries, chips, rare earths, critical raw materials, but also in terms of defense and in terms of irregular migration. When it comes to energy, climate policy helps us to be much less dependent on imported energy, primarily oil and gas. Energy generated by wind, solar, and nuclear power has made us much more autonomous, much more independent. In 2023, half of our electricity consumption was carbon-free, already now, half of our electricity consumption. So climate change helped us to get much more strategically independent, especially in the field of energy. The US, the EU, and China, the main global actors, are all working hard on their strategic independence or strategic autonomy. It means becoming less dependent on others in crucial sectors. But autonomy does not mean autarky. Global trade is still growing with 3%. In this context of trade war, bilateral trade agreements between the European Union and other countries, such as Mercosur, Brazil, and Argentina, free trade agreements with Indonesia, and hopefully free trade agreement with India are crucial, even if they are a second best compared to global free trade. Those free trade agreements are of geopolitical importance. If we want to be a geopolitical actor also in the economic area, we need to approve as soon as possible, for instance, the trade agreement with Brazil and Argentina, which we call the Mercosur agreement. The EU also needs to change course when it comes to industrial policy. We have, and it is all acknowledged by the Union, we have a competitive handicap. To be honest, The EU is lagging behind China and America in the strongest growth factor, namely the digital and artificial intelligence. It is not enough to be a trendsetter in the field of regulation. I am referring to the Digital Services Act, to the Digital Market Act, to the Artificial Intelligence Act. The EU is a leader in regulation, much to the dislike, by the way, of the Americans. But it is not enough to be a trendsetter in the field of regulation if we have far too few innovative companies of our own. By the way, and this is just a consideration, more than a footnote, but you can consider it as a footnote. By the way, in the first half of this year, investment in IT and data centers accounted for all of the growth in the US economy. 100% of the growth of the US economy in 2024 was due to the investment in IT and data centers. 100%. And this small sector, 6% of GDP, kept America growing. Just 4 companies, Google, Microsoft, Amazon, and Meta, account for the lion's share of this capital spending. Hopefully, the US can avoid the bursting of the artificial intelligence bubble and the repeat of the dot-com crisis of the year 2000. If the market mood changes, things could turn very nasty. Last month, a former chief economist of the International Monetary Fund, of the IMF, estimated that the stock market correction of the scale of the dot-com crash of 2000 could wipe out over 20 trillion in US household wealth, equivalent to roughly 70% of US GDP. Given the significantly higher exposure of retail consumers to US equities these days compared to the year 2000. This is, as I just said, far larger than the losses incurred in 2000 and could have a devastating effect on consumer confidence and spending on the American GDP and on world GDP. The American economy is one of two speeds, namely that of the Magnificent Seven and the rest. The social and political malaise in the US originates precisely in the rest of the economy, which has been affected by globalization. And this is where the tariff war originated, in order to protect the non-Magnificent Seven part of the American economy. Just to give evidence to what I said, at end September, the 7 magnificent stocks were worth more than the entire Chinese stock market, more than all European stock markets combined. The government may have been shut down, but artificial intelligence is keeping, for the time being, the lights on. But the EU must restore its competitiveness in all areas, not just in new technologies. Our energy costs are 3 times higher than those in the United States. The de facto devaluation of the dollar and the appreciation of the euro by almost 10% in a few months' time is an additional competitive handicap for us on top of the 15% tariffs on our exports to the US. So we have now a handicap of 25%, an increase of 25% in the last months vis-à-vis in the American market. 1 year after publishing his report on competitiveness, Mario Draghi just had to conclude that progress has been too limited. The Union knows what it needs to do. So why aren't we doing it? We need a genuine Europe-wide projects financed by European funds on the European capital markets. In today's globalized world, size and scale are essential. The absence of a European capital markets union is a real handicap for middle-sized and large companies eager to expand. We must learn to act and think European, beyond your own turf. I sincerely hope we can. The European Union defends worldwide open markets, but we are not naive anymore. If needed, we protect some of our activities without falling into general protectionism. And again here, it is more than just playing with words that we need to protect, but without falling into protectionism. It's a summary of our approach these days. To those who blame the EU to become less open, I recall that the China exports to the EU have increased with 100% the last 10 years. The European exports to China grew with 50%. So who is open and who is protecting? We are very conscious about our economic problems. But other global actors are facing other serious problems. We are very conscious about our economic problems, but other global actors are facing also serious problems. The United States will have to face one day its fiscal deficit. Its budgetary deficit is double of that of the eurozone. And it had to face one day its high public debt. Its public debt is 35%, one-third, higher than, in terms of GDP, higher than that of the eurozone. If the US would apply to become a member of the eurozone, we cannot accept them. They are not meeting our criteria. China, just, I say it as a joke, of course, but just to illustrate, to give evidence to the dimension of the budgetary problem in the US. China has a youth unemployment rate of at least 17%. This is a social time bomb. So other global actors have not the same problem as we have, but they have big, big challenges ahead. In the EU of the 1960s, we were also lagging economically behind the US. But in the decades that followed, we caught up. From 1990 to 2020, the GDP growth per capita was the same in the US and in the European Union. Since 2020, there is a significant divergence due to the US investments in the digital and artificial intelligence, and also due to the stagnation of the German economy since 3 years. This stagnation is due to a lack of investment in the private and public sectors for many years, and a lack of innovation, for instance, in the automotive industry, which accounts for 20% of German exports. Germany has a catching up plan, especially in the area of defense. I hope they will succeed. Wait and see. When it comes to defense, it is apparently also difficult to cooperate among member states on an industrial level, judging by the disputes over a new fighter jet. The fragmentation in terms of military equipment compared to that of Russia, America, and China remains distressing. It's not new. We know this problem for many, many years. But of course, now we are in a very tense period. We should spend more, but also spend better. And by spending better, I mean spending much more together than we do today. Incidentally, we will dedicate in a few years' time 3.5% of GDP to defense in a narrow sense of the word. That is more than in the Cold War. The European Commission has presented a European Defence Readiness Roadmap to enable the Union to reduce its strategic dependencies, address its critical capability shortfalls, and strengthen the European technological and industrial defence base. Some are comparing this roadmap on defence to the roadmap that created the single market and the economic and monetary union, actually the eurozone. Dear friends, a geopolitical power must be economically and militarily strong. Russia and the EU lack at least one dimension. The reality is that the US and China have both. They are economically and militarily strong. I add another global challenge, demographics, that will play a huge geopolitical role in the coming decades, not only in Europe, but also in China, in Japan, in Russia. China's population can, according to some projections, decrease to a level of 630 million by the end of this century. That is halving the level of today, halving the level of today. The European Union is going down from 450 million today to 420 million. India's population will be at least 2 times bigger than China by the end of this century. And Africa, Europe's closest neighbor, will quadruple to an unsustainable level of 4 billion inhabitants, which is a huge potential of migration. By the way, on migration, from a purely economic point of view, migration could offer a solution for demographic decline, and I say it again, not only in Europe, China, Japan, Russia, and so on. So migration could offer a solution for demographic decline and shortages on the labor market, but illegal migration in particular is met with strong social resistance in almost all countries, in the East and in the West. Finally, Europe must go its own way in this new world. How to do it? That's my last series of considerations. The new post-war Europe doesn't want to dominate world politics. Why should we, anyway? 2 world wars have made us choose a different political and geopolitical model. Making your own country great always means you should make other ones small. And that's what we practiced before the Second World War and during the Second World War, trying to make the others small. So we will not repeat this historical mistake. The balance of power in the world has shifted. But that doesn't be dramatic at all. We are not jealous or obsessed with the fear of no longer being the greatest. We give up that fantasy in the 1950s. Precisely because of globalization, the ratio of advanced to emerging economies in global GDP reversed in a single generation. So this ratio was 60-40, 40 for the advanced and 60 for the advanced and 40 for the emerging. So it is reversed from 60-40 to 40-60 in one generation. Nevertheless, our high level of prosperity continues to grow in Western countries, but elsewhere it grew faster. And to a certain extent, this is normal because mature economies simply grow more slowly than middle-income countries. The power of other global actors should not be overestimated. Power is therefore a relative concept. How many offensive wars were won by major powers since the 60s, question mark. And if they were won at all, they were what we called Pyrrhic victories. So there's not a real victory in the longer term. There was always a setback that outweighed the so-called gains. Look at the dramatic consequences of the second Iraq war on the Middle East as a whole. If we have problems today in the Middle East, it's also due to the second Iraq war. The Russia's military so-called power is also a good example. The major summer offensive in Ukraine resulted in the capture of a number of villages, not even cities. The human toll for this limited result is estimated at tens of thousands, according to some even 100,000. So we should, power is a relative concept, and we should not overestimate the powers of other global actors. The main question for us Europeans today is, what is needed to protect our interests and our values in order to develop our own economies and the welfare states? This doesn't mean Europe before everything, but it is about a new balance between the general global and the European interests. They can coincide, those general global interests and the European interest. Just as we in the European Union must constantly strike a balance between national and European interests. And most of the time, we are succeeding in this balancing act. To conclude, we must take our fate in our own hands. Even in a world where we often have to watch powerlessly as tragedies unfold. But powerless does not mean hopeless. We must create our own hope. And when I say turning fear into hope, it's our own responsibility. Hope is not a grace coming from heaven. Hope is a verb. We are the authors, the creators of our own hope. Thank you so much for listening.